Oui.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's masterclass, The Art of Looking at Art. As the head of education and outreach at MAP, I must say that this is a theme that I'm personally very excited about, which is at the heart of a lot of the work that we do at MAP. We believe that art is a pervasive part of our everyday lives, whether it's something we notice or not, from the textiles we wear to the sort of rangoli that we find on our doorsteps. Not to mention that given it's festival time in India at the moment, the artistic forms that are inherent in our rituals, our traditional cultural practices. And while on the one hand, the Durga idols at the pandals and the Golu dolls seem to grow more elaborate and inventive every year, with a lot of public attention, interest, debate, and pleasure taken in them, whenever it comes to a question of engaging with art that moves into an institutional or a historical context, it seems to somehow become, alien, unapproachable, inexplicable, or even pretentious. But there are personal resonances for us to find when engaging with art, any artwork, no matter who made it, where it was made, when it was made, or how it was made. And we're very pleased to have with us Ben Street today, unpacking this idea a bit more, debunking the very popular and sadly unfounded belief that we all need to be experts in order to really look at art, and helping us discover not only how to look at art, but also, perhaps more importantly, how to take joy in it. Ben Street is an art historian and a writer who has worked as an art history lecturer and educator at a wide variety of institutions, from the Museum of Modern Art and the Guggenheim in New York to the Tate and the National Gallery in London. He is the author also of a number of books on art for both young and adult audiences, including his latest, How to Enjoy Art, a guide for everyone, which forms the foundation of a lot of what he's going to talk to us today about. So on behalf of everyone at MAP, thank you so much, Ben, for agreeing to do this. We're very excited and looking forward to today's presentation. Also, thank you, Deepika from Signable, who is our ISL interpreter for today's session. And finally, thank you to all of those of you who have shown up today on what I know is an extended festive weekend for lots of people. So thank you for taking the time to come out here today. One last reminder just to the audience, any questions that you have, please feel free to type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And those will be taken and answered towards the end of the session. Ben, thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you, Shilpa. Thank you, everyone, for coming along. And thank you so much to MAP for inviting me to do this presentation. I'm going to share my screen. And you should hopefully see the cover of my book there. I'm going to be working through some of the objects that I talk about in that book. But I'm also going to talk about a couple of objects from the MAP's own collection, really to illustrate and to think about the ideas that are in this book. Thank you, Shilpa, for the lovely introduction. As she said, I've worked at many museums in different contexts with very different audiences and very different objects. And this book is the product of that experience. It is a book without a lot of biographies or historical context. It's all about the encounter with art in the present tense. So actually being in the presence of a work of art, and how we can enjoy that experience, get a kind of, have a richness of experience with objects we might not know. So I'm going to just shrink my own face so I can look at the images better. And as mentioned, if you have any questions, please do write them and I will look at them at the end of this presentation. So, as I said, this book comes from my experience as a museum educator, as a classroom teacher, but also as somebody who has written for museums over many years, writing the texts that go on the walls of museum exhibitions, sometimes writing the audio tours that you hear when you go through a museum. Sometimes I'm the person taking you through the museum and talking about the art. So this is a book that comes from the inside. And I love museums, but I want to use the book to explore some of the problems of museums and some of the ways that museums can prevent people from feeling confident in enjoying art. Because one of the most important words in this book, for me, is the word confidence. I want this book, and this presentation will cover some of this ground too. I want this book to hopefully inspire confidence that you or anyone could walk into a museum, a gallery, an artist's studio, a private collection, a religious building, anywhere else, somebody's home, where a work of art might be. I want people to feel that they can engage with that without needing to do lots of reading, without needing to be an expert, that it can be a pure experience. I just said that there are problems, and this is the exterior of the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which I know is nothing like MAP. It's a very Western notion of what a museum should look like. But I'm using it because I want to think about why many people feel that there's a kind of distance between them and the art. I find that people generally don't feel distant from music or distant from books or films. But so many times I've met people who feel distant from art. Now, one way that we can feel distant is through the architecture of museum spaces, because museums are the place where we most often encounter works of art. Now, this building is huge. It's grand. It's rather intimidating. It suggests a certain kind of social class that it's built for. It suggests a certain level of intelligence. It suggests a certain cultural tradition that goes back to ancient Greece, which feels quite heavy. It can feel quite intimidating. For me too, it can feel like an intimidating prospect. You're walking along the street, but you leave the street behind. You go up the stairs, and as you go up the stairs, you are ready for your art experience. You get in the museum, and this is not the Metropolitan Museum. This is the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. but it's a quite similar place. You go in and you think, where do I begin? The Metropolitan Museum, the Kunsthistorisches Museum. I'm talking about Western museums because that's my professional experience, but it could be applied to many other museums too. Museums always contain more objects than you can possibly see in one visit. That's true. You couldn't see everything in one visit. So for instance, I love this photograph. I mean, it's not great quality, but I love the fact that these two women have entered the room and they look like they don't know where to start. I think we've all felt that, haven't we? We've all felt that experience with museums where we think it's overwhelming. Where do I start? Now here, the paintings are hung all the way up to the ceiling. So some of them you can't even see properly. So the answer is, when we go to a museum, we first of all should not feel that we have to see everything. The most important thing in a museum visit is quality, not quantity. The quality of the encounter. How can we have a quality encounter with a work of art? Well, the only way we can have a quality encounter is by doing it slowly. There's no other way of doing it. If you went into this room and you looked at everything, and then you left the room, how much of it would you really remember? Just ask yourself. Maybe you'd remember one or two paintings. But if you spent a long time with one of those paintings, just looking, maybe drawing, maybe not, maybe just looking, gradually something happens. Something that's actually quite magical, which is that you start to develop a relationship with that object. It's the only way of doing it is to take your time, slow down. I'm going to talk more about that as we go along. But of course, all museums, as I said, all museums have more things in them than you could possibly see in one go. So here are 3 museums that I've been to that I love, but I had that exact experience in. Naples on the top left, full of beautiful classical sculpture. Tokyo on the top right, full of beautiful, that's Gandhara Buddhist sculpture there in that particular room. And on the bottom left, the Museum of Modern Art in New York. There's lots of great American modernist art that you're seeing there from the 1950s. In any of these encounters, you have to make a decision. Are you going to just walk through and try and make sure that your feet have been in every space in that museum? Or are you going to try and have a quality experience? Choose something. Make a decision to stay with that object. Now, people don't do this that often. And they might not do this because they feel in a museum context that you should see everything in order to have an experience of that museum. I don't think that's true. I also think people don't do it too often because many people don't know how to do it. And I know that seems strange. We all know how to stand or sit. We all know how to be still. But we very often don't know how to do it in front of a work of art. We get restless. We want to go somewhere else. We see another object and we think, I should be seeing that one. But the only way to have that quality experience is to slow down. The only way to have that great quality experience is to take your time. Now, there's something risky about doing this. The risk of doing it is the risk of being wrong. Now, that's another thing that I've experienced many times, which my book is kind of about, I guess, is the idea of feeling, and I've met many, many people who feel this way, of feeling that they don't know. They don't have the knowledge. So they can't even begin to engage with the artwork. Let me give you an example of something quite different. If I listen to a song or a piece of music, I can listen to it and appreciate it. I may know nothing about it. I may know nothing about the musicians, about the song itself, about when it was recorded, about anything, but I can have an immediate response to it. And I never question it. And I bet you don't either. I never say to myself, I could be wrong about this. I just enjoy it. My enjoyment is emotional, intellectual. It can be nostalgic. It can be many different things. I have no problem with doing that with music. And I have no problem with doing it with art. But I know many people do. And I want to tell you that it's the same sort of encounter. So I thought it would be a really good idea to demonstrate to you the value of risk. Because it's one thing about stopping and looking, and it's another thing about the value of risking being wrong. And it's perfect for me because this is an object that I have chosen from the map collection by an artist I know nothing about. And it's great sometimes, by the way, to know nothing, because it means you can have an immediate response. Let me say something here. If you're thinking, does he mean we should never read about art? I am an art historian. So I write in an academic context about art. So yes, I do believe in the value of art history. But I think art history has to start with the object, not with the book. It has to start with looking and not with reading, unless the artwork is text, which is a different thing. Very often when we go to museums, we get tired, very tired. There are many reasons for that. But one reason is we can spend more time reading than looking. And that is a shame, no? Because we really should be looking more than we're reading. So that's what I wanted to do with this. I chose this object from the map collection because it grabbed me. It grabbed me because it keeps unspooling. That's a strange word to use. I mean, it keeps rolling in my mind. It keeps getting more complicated the more I think about it. Questions I ask about photography are questions that allow me to think more about it, not questions that stop me thinking. So a good question to stop me thinking is, who's the artist? I'm going to get to that. I'm going to show you what's on the wall or what's would be next to it. But I just want to start with the object. So I'm not asking questions like that. I want to ask open questions. I want to ask about where we are. Where are we? Every photograph has a hidden, invisible ghost presence in it. The ghost presence of the photographer. So we're in the car, we assume, because we're given information. I'm just asking myself questions. I see what looks very much like a car. Hey, it could be a movie set. It might not be a car, but the information I've been given tells me car. We're in the back of the car. The woman is being driven. The car has just stopped, or the car is parked. I don't know any of that information. I can only go on what I see. What I see is three faces that are looking. So three different, what you might call gazes, three different ways of looking. These three women, or two women and one statue of a woman, are all looking in different kinds of ways. So there's a network, like a spider's web, of different kinds of looking. Two pairs of eyes are going that way, out of the photograph, to something that we can't see and we will never see. We will never see it. So there's already a mystery happening there of those two pairs of eyes. One pair of eyes that can't see because it's a statue, and one pair of eyes that can see, but not quite that well because they're wearing sunglasses. So there's vision that's slightly impeded. So not properly seeing. This is where my mind is going. Not properly seeing seems to be a theme within the photograph. Who is looking at who? So the woman in the middle, we look at her because of the way the photograph is constructed, because of the frame of the window, because of the fact that there's lightness and darkness in the tone within that frame, and because of the fact that her eyes look with such a power towards this woman that doesn't look at her. The thing that really disrupts the photograph for me is the statue. The statue that transforms the relationship between these women, because the statue head and the woman with sunglasses head are like each other. They're still, they're stony, they're looking that way, they're not responsive, but the woman in the middle is active physically. Her hand is there. She looks. There's a sense of movement about her and a sense of stillness about everything else. So within the photograph, there are relationships of stillness and motion, of looking and not looking, of darkness and of light, of framed and unframed. Now, these are all things that are just coming from me looking. They're not coming from my research about this artist. I'm sure there's lots to say. For me, it's incredibly rich as an image because all of these ideas are coming into my head. Are the ideas in the image? No, the ideas are between the image and me. Because the art is the space between. The art is the space between the object and the viewer. That's where the art is happening. When the museum is closed and the lights have turned off, those objects are still artworks, but they're not really artworks in a true sense. They're only artworks when they're looked at. When they're looked at, they come to life. And I use the analogy with books. I'm sure you can see behind me, I've got some shelves of books. Those, I haven't read all of them, but those books right now are just things in my house. They're just heavy objects that get in the way, that are hard to move around. They look nice, but I barely look at them, to be honest. And mostly they provide me with a Zoom background that makes me look like an intelligent person. I mean, it's theatre, really. The truth is that those books only become art when they're read. We know this. The same thing goes for objects of art like this photograph. Now, what if I were in the museum and I looked at the caption and I get this information? I get told that the photograph has a title. I get told the artist's name. I get told the date. I get told you have the size of it there, but you would know the size if you were standing in front of it. And we have how it was made. Now, we might go into a museum and say, oh, I don't know what silver gelatin print is. Doesn't matter really. I mean, that's a technique which is interesting, but that's not the most important thing. Look at that. Look at the title and ask yourself the question, what else could it have been called? It could have been called Three Women. It could have been called In the Car. It could have just been called Delhi. It could have been called Untitled. It could have been called the 13th of August, 1997. It could have been called The Name of the Woman Outside, The Name of the Woman Inside. Any one of those titles would have completely changed the way we see it. Because the title tells me statue seller Delhi, I know that the title is about her outside the window. In other words, she's the focus of the title, not the woman on the left. So that might help me think a little bit more about my initial reaction. I have my initial reaction, and then I bring in information slowly, so that I'd love it if I just got fed the information in little pieces. So, statue seller Delhi, okay. Does it change what I said before? Maybe a little bit it does. It helps, it's make it richer for me. But I didn't start with the text, I started with the image. Statue seller Delhi, so I have a place. Now I have the name of the artist, Pamela Singh. You might say, oh, Pamela Singh, I know her body of work, etc. I might say, I don't know who that is. So this is somebody, I mean, it might be meaningful, it might not be meaningful. 1997. So I might think 1997. What is the meaning of that date to me? And how does this image have a relationship to that knowledge? Everyone has associations with dates. You might have no association, but every piece of information needs to be really thought about. Silver gelatin print, that's the image rights, that's a whole different thing, so don't worry. The size is important because the size can tell us how we might respond to it physically. Let me show you what I mean with the next image. This is in my book, and I want to use it to think about the size of a work of art. We go into a museum, we see something we want to see, and we're walking or moving towards it, however we're moving. We're moving towards it. We might say to ourselves, we only start thinking about it when we get in front of it, but that's not true. We start thinking about it as soon as we see it. Because as I walk across the museum towards this object, I'm aware of it in relation to myself physically. And as I come closer and closer, I see how small it is. And this is not anybody I know, it's a photograph that I found on the internet, but it illustrates relative scale as an important thing to consider. If we have a statue that is significantly smaller than us, it immediately creates a relationship between our bodies and the object. The relationship is interesting. There are some sculptures that are so large that you have to step back to be able to see them. And they feel large in meaning too. A large scale sculpture feels louder, feels more dramatic. It feels as though it's speaking louder. A large sculpture can be seen, let's say, by 200 people at the same time. But what about this? 2 people, 3 people, hardly anyone. This doesn't feel as though it's shouting. It feels as though it's whispering. Now, when we think about objects and sound, it's useful because we can just start thinking, don't worry about the artist. Don't worry about the title, the date. Just think about how it speaks, the tone of voice. It speaks quietly. Only a few of us can see it at once. It's a little model or a sculpture of a male body. It's smallness. Imagine making it. Imagine what it was like to hold it. There's a different relationship between a sculpture you can hold and a sculpture that is huge. It's all about trying to understand the tone of voice of an artwork, the tone of voice. Sometimes it's something you do without realizing. You work out the tone of voice of an object. It can't speak, it can't sing, but it still communicates in that kind of way. The smallness creates intimacy, quietness, closeness. The smaller an object, the closer you have to get. That closeness creates an atmosphere. This is before you've even looked at the label. But why don't we look at the label? You might just be able to see it. They've given it a title. But almost every object ever made by humans does not have a title. So when we see something quite old, this is 500 years old. When we see something quite old like this, we see the title and we have to remind ourselves that's probably not what he called it. He probably didn't call it anything. Pamela Singh in 1997, certainly, I think, chose that title. But Michelangelo Buonarroti, in other words, Michelangelo, did not use this title. So change it. Change it. Call it Untitled. Call it Figure of a Man. Call it Autumn. Call it Winter. Call it Pain. Call it something that's different. See what happens when you do that. We have the artist name and the date. Maybe the date means something to you. Maybe it means nothing. But this is all information that you can use to understand how the object is speaking. Objects use scale all the time. How about this installation of objects that are on the floor of the museum? There are many examples in contemporary art made across the world of artists placing their objects in unusual places, placing them in the corner, placing them on the ceiling, or in this case, on the floor. So let's imagine that we're in the museum and we are heading towards the room where this artwork is. And as we walk, we don't see it. We see paintings, we see other things. That room looks empty. So straight away, I'm thinking, why? I'm starting to think about that. Let me stop for a second. When I say take your time with works of art, what it also means is being very self-aware. It's saying, how am I thinking now? How do I feel now? It seems empty, which is a contrast with everything else. That is already quite interesting to think about. As we get closer to the room, we start to see that there's something on the floor. It's like not one thing. It's lots of stuff. It's like trash. It's like rubbish. It almost looks random. It looks as though it's been thrown onto the floor. So far we know nothing about it, but we know two things. We know one, it's very hard to see. And we know two, it's scattered. And that's already really interesting because it's not like anything else you see, right? Because most things you see in a museum, you can see them and they're not scattered, they're one thing. So this is immediately a different tone of voice. You get into the room and you can bend down close to them, which means that you're crouching, or maybe not just crouching, just bending down a little bit to get closer to it, which means that instead of stepping back to take in the sculpture or moving forward to see that wax body, you're bending down, which means that your physical relationship to the artwork is really different. What's it like? It's like going to the floor to pick up a piece of rubbish that fell on the floor. It's like listening to a child talking. It's like bending down to pick a flower. Now, all of those things, that may not be what the artist is thinking, but it's what we're thinking. So it's part of the art experience. All of those things I described require care and slowness and not too much quick movement. That's another thing to think about. And when we get close to them, we see what they are. They're recognizable things. The skins of fruit that's dried up. Bananas, oranges, satsumas, or other things with skin. The flesh of the fruit has gone and it's been stitched together. Always make yourself work. If you make yourself work, you're going to get so much more out of it. If I said to you, okay, here's an example. Let's imagine you can't see this, and I have to tell you what I'm seeing, and you want to be able to describe it to somebody else. So you need a lot of information from me. So if I said, I'm talking about the middle, the one on the right, the middle object. If I said it's an old orange stitched together, you might say, well, how is it stitched? What color are the stitches? How many pieces is the skin in? What is the stitching, tight or loose? Has it been careful or is it quite sloppy? Is it precise like the stitches of a wound? Or is it loose like quickly stitching up a piece of fabric? All of those things will help us to be better at looking. Because one of the things that I want to think about is the idea that you can read all the books and you can learn so much about art. But the best way to be better is to do it more and do it slowly. If you do it slowly, you actually get better at it. Looking at art is an art. You can look at it quickly, but you'll never get anything from it. But if you choose to stay and look at it slowly, then you will get more, your looking will be enhanced, it'll be richer, it'll be stronger. This is an artwork by an artist called Zoe Leonard. I'm looking at the label. Zoe Leonard, it's from 1992, and it's called Strange Fruit. That's quite nice information. Strange fruit, you might say, it is quite strange, and they are fruit, and that might be enough, and that's fine. Or you might say, I know the song. There's a famous song by Billie Holiday, the great American singer, and her song Strange Fruit is about lynching. It's about African American people being killed in the South of America at that time. So it has a political spin. But if you don't know that, it's okay. Because your engagement with it might be nothing more than it's on the floor, it's scattered, it's loosely made. All those things will start your creative energies going. They'll get your imagination working. And that is what every artist wants. Every artist wants an audience that is receptive. No artist wants an audience who just walks past or who just stands, reads the text and moves on to the next thing. Because the artists don't write the texts. The texts are written by the museums, of course. So it means that we have to break our habit of reading. We have to risk being wrong. And we also have to risk, I hate to say it, we have to risk being bored. I've found some of the most productive and exciting art experiences I've ever had are when I made myself look, even though I didn't really want to. Or I got so bored. But the boredom is useful. The boredom is something you have to sit through. You break to the other side. If you're bored, it means you're not really looking at it. If you turn your eyes on and you really look and you do that thing where you describe it to yourself, so what kind of stitching, what kind of fruit, then you're getting closer and closer and closer to the artwork. And it means that your experience will be quality experience. Let me give another example from Map. I think I have it. Yeah, look at that. Quality of my image is not quite as good as it might be. But that's okay, because this is designed to encourage you to go to Map when it opens and see the real thing. But let me do the same thing again. Let me risk being wrong. Let me risk being wrong. Because I want to demonstrate that you can still get something from it. So I'm standing in front of an object. It's a painting. If I'm going to describe this to you, how will I do it? Well, it's a mostly grey field. Like a lot of the painting is grey. I mean, it's not all grey, but a lot of it is grey. And because a lot of it is grey, I don't know where to place that. Grey like what? Grey like concrete? Grey like a street? Grey like a wall? Grey, is that grey like the sky? Right now in London, the sky is pretty much that colour. Grey. Like it's a colour that maybe, I'm just trying to find a way in. It's a colour that maybe feels cold to me, but it might not feel that way to you. But the grey colour is a big part of the painting, because most of the painting is that. Even though we look and say fish, fish, or something else, most of it is not that. So this artist has made a decision to use a great deal of almost empty space. I don't know where I am. I see, I think, 3 different sections. They are roughly horizontal, one on top of the other, and they are centered through the vertical. So it's quite symmetrical. I mean, it's not symmetrical, but it's quite symmetrical. So I have a sense of organization. It doesn't feel scattered. It doesn't feel random. It feels very controlled. But what I'm seeing on this controlled surface is 3 different things that are like each other, but also not. A fish shape at the top. In the center, what looks to me like a landscape or a building with this kind of doorway in the center, which is pretty much in the center of that vertical line. And if I go down one more, I have this object, like a rock, like a vase, like a bowl, I don't know. And on it is a carved fish. So fish, carved fish, rock, mountain, doorways. There's that shape, which is like the shape of a thumb. It's like a thumb. It's the same kind of shape in the doorway and on the rock. So there's little relationships within the painting that slowly reveal themselves the longer I look. What's the relationship of scale? This object that's at the bottom has got a dark shadow. Nothing else has. So maybe these are 3 separate, isolated, unrelated places or situations that happen to be together. They seem, because of the color really, the rock thing seems near and the mountain area seems far. So there's a sense of space. But the relationship between the parts seems to me to be about color and shape, not about literally this is here and that is there. It seems to be about shape, things being like each other that otherwise are very different. What I think about, and again, I know nothing about this, what I think about is the way the mind works when you remember something or when you're dreaming. The way you might say, I had a dream and I was in a place and I knew it was my house, but it didn't look like my house. And I was with my friend and I knew it was my friend, but it didn't look like my friend. That's the logic of dreams. This to me seems like a painting which has dream logic, where things are like each other in the dream, but in reality, they're not. So I've just spent not very long, I'm imagining myself in front of the object, just having these thoughts and asking myself those questions. How would I describe it? How does color work? Why did he choose to place them there? Why are they not in the center? Why are they not further down? And of course, what I can't do is I can't get close to the object to see the surface, to see the way the thing is made, because that's what I want to see. But let's say, okay, I'm going to let myself look at the label. So here's the label. Real, unreal. Prabhakar Barwe, I've mispronounced his name. I really apologize. I don't know exactly how to pronounce his name. That's my fault totally. But I would do the same thing in the museum. I would read it and I would not know how to say it. So I do apologize. 1988, oil on canvas. Okay. The height, like just over a meter high. So it's a bit wider. So yeah, it's about 1.5 meters wide. And a bit, yeah, so it's not huge. Maybe a few of us could see it. Maybe 3 or 4 of us could see it at once. Not 100. So I think, okay, tone of voice. It's not huge, but it's not tiny. It doesn't shout, but it doesn't whisper. It's got a kind of even conversational tone, I think. And I look at the title and I think, well, I was thinking about dreams, and real, unreal is a pretty good description of how a dream feels. Don't you think so? It feels real and unreal at the same time. And then I see brackets fishes. Well, I say, well, I saw the fishes. There are 2 fish. He wants to identify it for some reason. But how might you change it? What if we called it 2 fish? Then it would tell us that the artist wanted to focus on those aspects, but he doesn't, because he puts the fishes in brackets. He puts the fish over here. He wants you to focus on real, unreal. So the title describes not what the painting looks like, it describes the feeling. It describes the tone of the painting, I think. And then I see the artist's name and I might say, oh, I know his work, I love it. It looks like this, it looks like that. Or I might see it and say, I don't know who that is, but I really want to find out more. And then I see 1988 and I think to myself, what does that mean for me? How does that information help me? If I'm thinking about art, what kind of art might I think about in 1988? Well, who knows? If I'm thinking about politics, if I'm thinking about general global history, 1988, what does it mean? What about if I'm from America and I come over to Bangalore and I see this painting and I go, 1988, I don't know what 1988 was like for this man, but 1988 in America was like this. Now, It doesn't help me necessarily to understand the artist, but it helps the artwork get closer to me. Remember that I said that the art happens between the object and the viewer. It's not all in the object. It's in the moment of encounter. Just like the book, well, here happens to be a book in my hand. This object, which is all sealed, this is just a thing until I read it and it becomes something else. So that's kind of what that is all about. I want to find out more. It's a great example. I want to find out more about this artist, but I will remember how it felt to look. I just risked something. You may be sitting there saying, well, what you just said is completely wrong about this artist because I am the expert. Now that is fine, and I give you great respect for that. But the word wrong should not be in our vocabulary when we talk about art, because that's another way that people will not want to look at art. You know, I can't say, if somebody says, this is my favorite song, and it means so much to me because I used to listen to it when I was on the way to school, I can't say, you're wrong, can I? You say that means something to you because it has a relationship to your life. I can't say it's wrong. And the same thing goes for works of art. Unfortunately, we often think that there is a right or wrong. The important information can't be right or wrong. The name of the artist, the date, that's useful, but the really important stuff is what the artwork is doing. I feel that this process is about respecting artists. It's about respecting the artwork as something that needs a viewer to come to life. Now, I look at my time and I see some questions, so I'm going to look at the questions now and answer them as well as I possibly can, remembering that the risk of being wrong is always there, and I am embracing that. So let me see if I can answer. I've got these are really nice looking questions. So I'm going to read the questions and I'm going to try to answer them. So somebody has said, I'm going to read this out. How is the risk of being wrong a risk when individuals can perceive art in different contexts? Is there a right or wrong way to perceive art? Thank you for your question. And I think you make a very good point. There is not a right or wrong way. And it isn't really a risk, but it feels like one. I have so many times, this is from young people to elderly people to students that I've taught, people say, I could be wrong, but, or I might be reading too much into it, but, and these are all ways that people feel that they are risking something by maybe being wrong in front of the object. It isn't really a risk. In fact, it's really important that we have the conversation that could lead to being wrong. It's really important that we have it. But it does feel like a risk for people. And as I say, I've seen it over and over and over again. Let me be very clear. I don't mean that you can think anything you like, because artists make artwork in a certain way. This painting that's on the screen, I'm not going to think whatever I like about it, because everything I think comes from the object. What happens sometimes is we stop looking. If we stop looking and we start talking about the historical context, We're no longer looking at the painting. It's all useful. But if we're really looking at the object, we can't actually be wrong because we're basing what we say on what we see. So I've got a question from Rupkatha. I'm sorry, Rupkatha. I'm sorry if I've pronounced your name wrong. I'm really, really sorry. But thank you for your question. I hope that wasn't offensive. I apologize. Can art be an experience and not the object or art itself? Well, that's a great question. I think all art is experience. I think that is what it is. A painting can sell at an auction for millions of pounds, but you're not selling the experience. You're just selling a thing. It's just a thing. Until you look, it's not really, it's just a thing in the world. The Mona Lisa, for example, is just a thing on the wall of a building in Paris. It's just a thing. The Mona Lisa is not very big. You know, I could put it under my arm. I won't do it, but I could. The experience, when we use the phrase Mona Lisa, what we mean is not that thing. We mean the experience that happens with that thing. I hope that makes sense. It might seem like a strange thing to say, but for example, one of my favorite books is Moby Dick, right, by Herman Melville. Now, if you haven't read Moby Dick, and I say Moby Dick, you might say, oh yeah, is that one about the whale? But if I say Moby Dick and you've read it, then we're talking about an experience that we've had. We're talking about weeks or months of reading. Maybe we hated it, maybe we loved it, but we're just talking about something else. I mean, I could talk about a book I haven't read, but I can't really talk about it as an experience unless I've actually read it, if that makes sense. So Anna asks, how do we write about experiencing art? And if we're evaluating it from a political perspective, how do we reconcile the politics and the experience? Anna, that's a great question. The politics of art and the experience of art cannot be separated. They're the same thing. The politics of an artwork is totally embedded in the experience of encountering it, the experience of seeing it. But the political perspective is part of the art experience. You know, any work of political art is about creating a certain kind of experience that can be upsetting, it can be polemical, it can be confrontational, it could be affirmative, it could be lots of different things, but it's about an experience. Any propaganda is about creating an experience. So I think you have those two things are the same thing. So I don't think they're separate. It's hard to talk about sometimes. Talking about the experience is hard to talk about, and actually very often fiction does it better than art history. And that's interesting because I work as an art historian. Talking about the experience of looking is actually quite hard. Talking about the artist's life story is much, much easier. But the experience is the important thing, I think. So I've got a question. I will probably say your name wrong again, but Minukshi, what counts as art? Does art have to be beautiful? Is everything beautiful automatically art, even if it doesn't really evoke emotions? I love that question, but it's a big question. What counts as art is a very slippery thing. I think we, as human beings, have experiences with beauty all the time, don't we? I have experiences of beauty every day. You know, I have a little 2-year-old daughter. She's not beautiful all the time, but when she's beautiful, it's a beautiful moment. When I see something beautiful in nature, it's beautiful. When I see a beautiful act between human beings, an act of generosity, especially, is a beautiful thing. So those are all beautiful things, and beauty exists outside of art. In fact, it's bigger outside of art. But the question that you had about, hold on, let me just check that. The question that you had about art does not have to be beautiful, definitely not. And I don't think everything beautiful is automatically art. I do think art has parameters and boundaries. I think it's very fluid, but I think it is there are certain containers you can put it in. But I think the question of what counts as art is actually a cultural question. because it's not the same thing depending upon where you're speaking from, I think. But I also don't think art has to be beautiful. I think the experience doesn't have to be a beautiful experience. It doesn't have to make you, it can, when I use the word enjoy, so let me explain. The title of this changed a lot, but we kept coming back to the idea of pleasure. The idea of pleasure, which I think is important, because pleasure is not always something that leaves you smiling. Like, there can be an intellectual form of pleasure. There can be a form of pleasure which is about political motivation or activation. That's a kind of pleasure. I feel that pleasure is very important to understanding culture, but we don't talk about it that much. But yeah, I think that that's why I mentioned this thing about enjoyment. Enjoyment actually is a very broad kind of concept, and there's certainly works of art that are not meant to be enjoyed, but it's the same thing with music, isn't it? I mean, I have music in my collection. I have records behind me, you might be able to see. Some of it I listen to once a year because it's not that pleasant to listen to. I still love it, but I don't enjoy it in the same way as I enjoy something I listen to every day. But this is the nature of the way we engage with culture. I think it has to have that level of diversity about the experience. Every book is a different experience. Every artwork is a different experience too. Preeti asks, so isn't that to do with perspective? Every person's perspective is unique, right? Absolutely, I agree. That is actually the most important point, and thank you for making it. Everyone's perspective is unique. Every artwork is unique. But artworks are, a work of art, like a painting, like the one behind, one that you can see now, that painting isn't randomly produced. This artist worked very hard to make it look that way. There were deliberate decisions made about every object I've shown you is very deliberate. Even if it's got elements of chance, that's all part of the plan. So in order to have the experience, we bring together our perspective and our attention to what the artist has done. Because I don't think it's like, I want to defend artists at the heart of this, because my experience of looking at this water bottle is not the same thing as looking at the Mona Lisa. Leonardo da Vinci made certain decisions, and those decisions are there, and they're for me to engage with as part of my experience. So I think the artist's voice is very, very important too. I don't think it's open to whatever you like, but we have to be able to be open in order to have the experience to kind of encounter it. But we also, this thing about perspective and perception is so great that you said that. We do all have our own perspective, but we often feel that we can't express it, that maybe it's not relevant, that maybe because, let me give you an example. The last thing, maybe, because I see the time and I see we probably should finish. I used to work at the National Gallery in London, and there's a lot of Christian painting. And I would be with school kids who are not from a Christian background, which is a lot of school kids in London, who came to the National Gallery with their school, and they would sit down in front of a painting made 600 years previously in a Western European setting. And my job was to try and find a bridge between their life experience and the perspective of the artist. And there is always a bridge, whether it's through color, whether it's through scale, whether it's through pattern and texture, whether it's through storytelling. Any work of art is potentially open to absolutely anyone. But you've got to take time. It's the only way. Those school kids would not have come to the gallery if their school hadn't organised the trip, I imagine. And if their school hadn't asked for an educator to come, they may not have sat in front of that particular painting. But because they did, and because we asked questions about it, they were able to be brought closer to something that culturally, historically, spiritually, is a million miles away from their lives. But suddenly that distance became very short. And that is the art experience. And that kind of seems like a good enough place, I think, to stop and to maybe to hand back. I've got, oh, there we go. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm just going to hand back to Shilpa.
Thank you so much, Ben, for walking us through 50 minutes of this. That was very, very exciting. And I think that was a great note to actually end it on, because like you said, not only is everyone's perspective different, but your own perspective keeps changing, and it's entirely possible to come back and revisit an artwork and find entirely new meanings and discover entirely new worlds, and that's very exciting. So yes, I see somebody else in the audience has talked about how looking depends upon your own state of mind as well. Yeah, sure. So different, yeah, you could have completely different experiences on different days. So thank you for this experience tonight. It has been a lot of fun. And I have rediscovered new ways of looking at the two works in the map collection that you spoke about as well. Thank you so much to Deepika, who has been patiently interpreting for us this evening. Thank you to everybody in the audience who's joined in, stayed engaged, and sent in all your interesting questions. And have a good day.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming along. Thanks, Shilpa. Thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.